Tonight we are talking about the Great Rescue, and Josh has mentioned to you this week 2 meals are going to tell the story. The first meal, Israel's Passover, and the second, Jesus' Last Supper, 2 pretty famous meals. You might know that on the night before he was executed, Jesus hosted a special Passover meal with his disciples. A bit like our meal tonight, it would be of more Eastern arrangement, flatbread and so forth. And it was, as a Passover, a very ancient symbolic meal, but he used it to make his life and mission clear. So that's what we want to get in our heads tonight. So you might recall at our first meeting we reflected on the beauty and goodness of God's creation. We heard from the Bible that humans are described as being made in God's image, to be his image bearers. Last week we were conscious of and spoke about the brokenness of the world today. And the Bible says of that it stems from humanity going our own way. Trying to act independently of God means either ignoring him or, worse still, really supplanting him, deciding we will do better in that sort of role. And the Bible says, of course, that the result of that is evident. It's the alienation we have, not just from God himself, but from each other and from the created order. Whatever you do, don't turn on the television. Nearly everything that happens in the news just reinforces that to you in the most terrible way. And you just hear it again and again and again. And so the Bible says of us, we bear God's image, but in broken and distorted ways. And so what we need is rescue. That's what we need. We're actually in a situation that is beyond us. Now, the Bible, and I don't know, if you haven't cracked the Bible open and you thought, it's very big, how do I get into it? One of the things you'll do in the book, and you look in the table of contents, what you see is that it's not one book, it's bound together, but it's actually 66 individual works. We call them books, but there are a whole range of things, law and history and letters and all sorts of stuff, and prophecy, which is sort of mainly speeches, and the rest. 40 authors, written really covering a period, the historical period of about 2,000 years. So it's a mammoth sort of work, and that's the title page from a Bible sitting there. But it's got one storyline. The reason all the books are gathered together is there is one continuous storyline, and that storyline is God's plan to rescue his creation and his image bearers. So tonight we're going to see a little bit about that rescue mission, and we're going to see how it climaxes on Jesus himself. Now, the story begins with a man called Abraham, a name probably familiar to many, but Abraham was the man God chose and through whom he promised to bless all the nations of the earth as they themselves became a great nation in their own land. But actually, early on we see that they end up enslaved and oppressed in Egypt, and they are there for almost 4 centuries. It's a story actually of them in captivity. It's under Moses, another famous Old Testament Bible name, that they escape Egypt in what's called the Exodus. Fancy Greek word, it just means the way out. We'd probably call it the exit. It just doesn't sound as classy. In that Exodus, God's judgment falls on the Egyptians as their slave masters, falls on them as plagues, as disasters, and on the death of their firstborn. If you've read the story, you realise that in fact over many years that's exactly what the Egyptians were doing to the Hebrews. They were actually killing their firstborn children. They were killing in fact all their male children. Now before the Israelites leave, as God's rescue proceeds, they have a meal. And Robin, can I get you to come and read that for us? I'll whack it up on the screen, but listen to Robin.
Okay. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. This is how you are to eat it. with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance.
Thanks, Robin. And you can see there the Israelites killing a lamb, and they're going to eat the meat, but they take the blood and they paint it on the doors of their houses. It's a symbol, so God's judgment will pass over that house, and they're going to eat it as a hasty meal before they escape. And the Egyptians were therefore forced to let them go when that final plague happened to them, and that's the thing they call the Exodus, the escape from Egypt. And they celebrated Passover annually, and they did it so that they would never forget. So the sort of things they ate, a little bit like the things we've tried to have on the table tonight, and thank you to those who prepared the meal, that was excellent. Flatbread, made quickly without yeast because they were getting out of Egypt in a hurry. No time to wait. Bitter herbs, recalling the bitterness of slavery. And lamb, of course, which reminded them that something died in their place, the blood of the lamb in place of firstborn children. It was, as it were, a judgment and a rescue at the same time. That's the Passover story that sits constantly in the Jewish mind right back from the beginning and is part of their remembering that they were God's rescued people. When we come hundreds and hundreds of years later to Jesus, his big claim is that Passover actually points not just back to that, but forward to a bigger rescue which he's going to accomplish. And I want to say something about that in a minute, but before I get there, I want to take just a moment to say a little bit something about God's judgment. There are a few things that you can say about God that get people stirred up very rapidly, and talking about God's judgment is one of them. And it's not surprising. It's not popular, and it's not a comfortable idea to think that God would judge when you first hear that. We'd much rather talk about his love and his forgiveness. It's easier to speak about it, is more palatable, and certainly who wants to be on the receiving end of judgment? So it's completely understandable. Here are a few thoughts, though, about God's judgment that might really help us. I hope so. The first is that you've actually got to think about it, because if you're looking at the Bible at all, there is talk of judgment all the way through. It appears in a huge number of places. The Bible isn't shy about talking about the reality of God's judgment, and Jesus himself speaks about God's judgment quite frequently. So it's inescapable, if you're looking at Christianity, to avoid it. The second is, it's worth realising that God's judgment occurs in the context of oppression. It's a judgment on evil. It's not random action. It's action taken against evil. So in the story we've just heard, Israel has been enslaved in Egypt for many, many years. Now, if we've never been enslaved, and I'm certainly in that category, this is really hard to get your head round. But if somebody removed all your liberties, destroyed your children, made you work as their labourer, and when you complained, made that work harder, and deliberately took what these days would probably be called genocidal activity against you, you would think quite differently about it. And in fact, the story of the Exodus has been very popular amongst people groups who have actually felt oppressed. So Afro-Americans remembering slavery, well, the slaves themselves found these stories tremendous part of their own narrative. And many of the spiritual songs sing in terms of the Exodus because they were an oppressed people looking for rescue. And finally, judgment of God is in fact his answer to the cry for justice. And it's worth thinking about that too. You'd have to be pretty hard-hearted not to look at things like, well, you could list them, couldn't you? If you go back further than maybe the current ones, the Holocaust, child trafficking, killing fields of Cambodia, the massacres in Rwanda. I could go on, couldn't I? I could just go on and on and on. The three greatest actions of mass murderers, greatest is not a positive word, in the 20th century. Mass murderers of their own people, you can probably name those three. It's just everywhere. And you'd have to have a pretty hard heart not to want there to be justice to intervene in that situation. And that's the sort of situation we're talking about. Miroslav Volf, a theologian who himself lived through dark days of war in former Yugoslavia, wrote this. He was initially very negative about the idea of God's angry justice, his wrath. But he said, my last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which he came. He said, I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, but I have now come to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. He is wrathful because he is love. It's an action against evil and injustice. Well, those are thoughts maybe to help fuel a little bit of thinking, and we're going to have a pause for that now. One final thought before we do take a chance to have discussion around the table. People often have questions about God's judgment, and I think it's right to question and to try and get your thinking clear and to ask people. But here's a thought. It's often easy to see how right it would be for God to judge others. You know, the bad guys, the other guys. It is worth stopping and asking the question of ourselves, what would a just God say to me, or to us as a community, or to us as a culture? Most of us, faced with that prospect, would probably want and perhaps even expect God's forgiveness rather than his justice. And you then have the puzzle of, can God be both just and merciful? And that's a question you might like to think about. I've got that. You might think, what sort of rescue do you think we actually need? How do you think God's judgment might fit in that? We might take 5 or more minutes just to chat at table and see what's going through your head. Look, I'm sorry to interrupt you because there is no end to this sort of conversation to stop and think about. But as I said to Joe, if I don't get up here and finish the talk, there'll be no dessert. And I do want us to make sure we do get finished in the time frame that we've got. But it's a vital question to think about and really important to get our mind around it. Now, one of the big things out of the story of the Bible is that the best of answers to the question of God's justice and rescue is going to be found in what Jesus does when he dies on the cross. And we want to talk about that in the way he spoke about it, which was at that special Passover meal that I mentioned before. Jesus died that first Good Friday at Passover time. And just before he died, he ate the Passover meal with his 12 disciples. But as I said before, he made it look forward to his death, not just back to the ancient rescue. And we're going to hear a little bit about it. Angela, can you come and read that for us, a little bit from Luke's Gospel? That we do have copies of Luke's Gospel on the table, and we'll later be encouraging, if you haven't got one or would like a small version just to have, that's good to use. Anyway, if you want to read that for us, thanks.
When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you.
Shortly after this meal, Jesus was arrested, unjustly tried, and then crucified outside the city of Jerusalem at a site called Golgotha. He died and he was buried. It's through this meal, just before that happens, that he points us to the meaning of his death. And that's what we wanted to stop and think about. What did he actually mean? What was this meal pointing to? And one way to get our head around it might be to stop and think about a story which I think Australians became aware of, although it's actually now I think about 20 years old, judging by this. It did seem to me it was only very recent. But you might remember the story of the aeroplane crash in Missouri in the USA. They were going up for skydiving, and there was some problem with the plane. I think they hit a power pole, and the plane simply could not recover. There were a few minutes of awareness on the part of the passengers on the aeroplane that they knew that they were in serious trouble. There was a skydiving instructor, a young man, 22 years old, by the name of Robert Cook. And his partner was an Australian woman by the name of Kimberly, I've forgotten her surname, Kimberly Deer. She was 21 years old, so they're basically the same age. And she was going to be jumping with him, or he was going to be jumping with her. And when he realised that what was happening, he grabbed her, he calmly talked to her, he made sure that she knew that the plane was going to crash. He tried to keep her calm by paying attention to what he was saying. He clipped their harnesses together, and then he said to her, "The plane's about to hit the ground. Make sure you're on top of me. I'll take the force of the impact." Apparently, as everything twisted around, according to her father, when the plane went down, it was becoming very disoriented for Kimberly, but she felt him twist his body around until she was on top of him as the plane hit the ground. She survived. Serious injuries. She survived. He died. You might imagine the immense gratitude that the family feel for a rescue at the cost of his life. Now that's what Jesus is telling us he was doing. So when we think about this dying, he's talking about taking the full weight of the impact of our sin, our movement away from God, our orientation toward ourself rather than him. And he is dying in our place so that we can live. That's how he's talking about it. And there are three ways to think about the meaning of Jesus' death that spring out of this meal. And I'll just tell you them relatively quickly so they're in your mind. The first is that his death is addressing the problem of sin. We've thought about this over the past last week. The Bible says we have turned our backs on our Creator, we've ignored him, we've chosen to live our own way or making our own choices about what is right and wrong. And the Bible term for that is sin. It's this self-centering rather than God-centering of human life. Now, justice in that situation, you would imagine, would mean judgment on us. But we can see, say, as in last week's story of the prodigal son, Jesus would rather rescue and welcome back sinners like the father in the story who wanted restored relationships with both his sons. And it's the same for us. Like the two boys in the story, I guess you could say some of us have sinned in very obvious ways, others in fairly quiet ways, politely rebellious, wildly rebellious. But either way, we end up with a fractured relationship with God our Father, and what is needed is reconciliation with him. Now, we might say, well, yes, but my sin's not really a big deal. Jesus thinks it's a really big deal, and that's what this meal shows. He says, this is my blood poured out for you of his death. So it's a sacrifice language, giving up himself for. And he says it makes a new covenant. It re-establishes the relationship between God and yourself. So in his mind, the relationship is broken and it needs to be fixed. And the problem is sin and it needs to be dealt with. And he puts his body on the line literally for that to take place. So in his death, God's judgment on our sin falls on him, rescuing us. And that's where justice and mercy meet. There's a second thing. You remember that the Israelites had a slavery problem to be solved. And the Passover, of course, was a meal about rescue from Pharaoh's slavery. But according to Jesus, it's sin that is actually the great slave master because it has control over us. You might say, I don't have to do this particular sin, but if you look at your life, you'd say, but I still find I can guarantee that I will sin. So we're actually caught in it. Sin might mean doing wrong things, but it also means trapped in sin and can't stop doing things. And when Jesus died like lambs at the original Passover, it was to rescue us from the control of sin, that we could, as it were, escape out of it. It's like giving sin addicts the hope of coming clean. And there's a third thing. Jesus' death addresses the belonging problem. The Bible tells us again and again we can't flourish without the God who made us, but it also tells us we can't flourish without a community, without a people that we belong to. It's not good for humanity to be alone. And through his death, what Jesus does, he brings us into a worldwide, multicultural, multi-generational family, the family of God, ending alienation between people. And in fact, between peoples. Peoples whose groupings might be antagonistic towards each other can be together in Jesus in wonderful ways. So the Passover meal, which reminded Israel of who they were, or rather whose they were, in the same way Jesus uses the meal, and when he says of this now, he says, do this in memory of me, he's making sure that we realise that it is supposed to be a reminder of his death. So in churches all over the place, we celebrate the meal, the Lord's Supper, on a regular basis to remind us that Jesus, through his death, is creating a new people from every tongue and every tribe and every language who are together as one people who can say this is the essential element. The reason we are together is because of Jesus, who died for us. Reconciles us to God and to each other, fixing the problems of mankind. So 2 meals, 2 rescue meals, just to make us think carefully about what Jesus has done for us.